Brought to you by Biologically.
Welcome to Conversations. My name is Suresh Kochata. World Thrombosis Day is slated on the 13th of October, and the theme this year is Eye on Thrombosis. To discuss various aspects of thrombosis, we have been speaking to a set of specialist doctors across the country. And today we have with us Dr. Surabhi Awasthi, an interventionist with over 18 years of experience in critical care medicine. She did her MBBS from Mumbai, followed by MD in anesthesia from the prestigious Tata Memorial Hospital in Mumbai, and a fellowship in intensive care medicine. A National Talent Search Scholar, an ISCCM teacher with a number of published works. Dr. Surabhi is an alumnus of the Indian School of Business. Her expertise also includes audits, hospital operations, and inspections. This is in addition to the top-notch experience that she has in world's most well-known brands, healthcare brands, that is, and facilities in India, which has been heading the critical care facilities and emergency operations. Dr. Surabhi is presently serving as the Director and Head of Critical Care Medicine in a well-known Moolchand Healthcare Hospital in South Delhi. Welcome, Dr. Surabhi.
Thank you for having me.
We are here to discuss hospital-associated venous thromboembolism, or VTE, a topic in keeping with the World Thrombosis Day, which, as I said before, is on the 13th of October. The theme this year is Eye on Thrombosis. So, Dr. Surabhi, I'll start the process of asking you the questions, and we'll set the ball rolling from here. So the first question that I have for you is that we all have heard of thromboembolism, but can it be acquired from a hospital? That's the most crucial question that we need to ask. Can you just elaborate on this aspect?
Yeah, so first, before we start this, what is a venous thromboembolism or a VTE? It's basically a clot in the vein, and it is the third most leading cause of a vascular stroke or problem after heart attacks and after stroke. So it's very important. And VTE is mostly seen in your leg veins or your calf veins, or even your more proximal veins like your femoral, popliteal, and even iliac veins. Most of them are asymptomatic, but because they extend proximally, they can cause a lot of health issues. So that is why we discuss VTE, and it becomes very important in the healthcare setting. It is almost 130 times greater in hospitalized patients than in general population. So you can imagine the magnitude of the problem in hospitalized patients. Okay, and hospitalized patients can have VTE during their hospital stay and even 90 days post-discharge. So the risk of thromboembolism remains not only during the hospital stay, but also 90 days post-discharge. So whenever you're giving treatment for thromboembolism, we continue the treatment that long. Yeah, and so we have seen that most of the 60% of all VTE reported has been in the hospitalized patient. So you can imagine that the scenario of thromboembolism is really great. And because 70% or 80% of these cases are totally preventable by interventions you do in the hospital or medicines you give to the patient, that is why it becomes all the more important for us to basically understand the importance of hospital-acquired thromboembolism.
Yeah, doctor, because quite often we have heard various cases of thromboembolism. You talked about the aspect of acquiring it in the hospital, but it also happens on long-distance flights, if I'm not wrong, and some people acquire it from there. Of course, some people acquire it because of fractures and other things that happen with them. These are various aspects of it. So please correct me if I'm wrong here.
Yeah. So VTE has got a lot of risk factors, Let's now talk about the risk factors for the VTE. So there are, in the hospitalized patient, there are major ortho surgeries, like a patient going for a major hip surgery or a major knee surgery, or any pelvic surgery. The chances of that patient getting thromboembolism is always almost 50% in a hip replacement surgery without treatment or intervention. It's almost 70% in a TKR without any intervention or treatment. So you can imagine the magnitude of these, and these surgeries are very common. Then you have any patient who's having trauma, has been in an accident, has had a fractured pelvis or long bone fractures. Those patients are also very likely to get VTE. Or any major surgery like a pelvic surgery, huge abdominal surgery, or neurosurgery where the patient may be bedridden for some time, that also patient can get. Then the type of anesthesia is also important in hospital-acquired VTE, because we are talking mainly of hospital-acquired VTE. So a patient who's undergoing GA has been found to have more chances of getting VTE rather than a patient who's had a spinal block or an epidural anesthesia. And a patient who's had a CABG or any vascular surgery, because that patient is already having the tendency to have clots in the artery. So such a patient is also having more tendency to have clots in the veins. Other risk factors would be prolonged ICU stay, or a patient with an age of more than 45, the chances of VT increase. And you can actually multiply your age with 10. Like 45, 0.1, 10% or 0.1. So 45 age person has a 4.5% chance of getting VT. A 55 will have 5.5. So that is what I meant. Obesity is also a very important cause for VT. It is almost twice that of the general population. And the risk of VT increases more with your increase in your weight.
In fact, that was my second question coming. Sorry, interrupting you, Dr. Surabhi there. In fact, of all the patients who receive healthcare, roughly what percentage of patients actually develop the hospital-associated VTE? And what kind of risk profile do these patients actually have? Because I'm following up on the previous answer that we were giving, so I'm just getting into a bit of specifics.
And like what I told you, in a hip surgery, if a patient is not treated or interventions are not done, the risk of having a VT in a THR or a total hip replacement is almost 50%. Okay, and in the TKR, it's almost 70%. And this I'm talking of without interventions or without any treatment given to these patients for the prevention of VT. And for the fatal pulmonary embolism, which is the most bad risk which we fear as clinicians, the risk is almost 5% for a THR or a total hip replacement, and around 1 to 2% in a TKR. And in urology surgeries like prostate surgeries or even pelvic surgeries, without any treatment or prevention given to such patients, the risk of VT is almost 40%. So you can imagine the magnitude of the patients who will get VT with this.
I get it. In fact, that's the question I had following. That's the third question that's coming up actually. How do you identify a patient who has developed a hospital-associated VT? Because you give us an entire gamut of reasons why they can get it. So the question obviously would be that how do you identify such a patient? Because they must be exhibiting some other symptoms. So the doctor concerned has to actually identify and say, yeah, this is the patient who has got a VT and this has come from a hospital-associated VT.
So VT is always diagnosed in the hospital in a hospital-acquired infection, ideally. Right? So you have something called, there are two aspects of the VT. There is one clot in the vein which we call a DVT, that is deep vein thrombosis. And there is this clot coming out from the vein and going and blocking an artery in the lung, which is called pulmonary embolism. So DVT starts first and the pulmonary embolism is a later consequence. So for the DVT symptoms, like you will have a hospitalized patient, first you have to keep in mind the risk factors. So when you're going on your rounds and all, you know this patient is at a high risk of VTE. So in those patients, you will have swelling, you will have pain, you will have sudden redness or discoloration of the skin. These are all symptoms which he didn't have or she did not have before, and he has developed this. In the signs, you have tenderness, and you can actually feel a cord-like vein in the leg. You have a swelling of the leg, which is, you can compare it with the other leg, which is more. You have something called a Homan sign where you try to dorsiflex your leg. You have pain in the calf muscles, and there are many more signs. For pulmonary embolism, which I said, where that vein thrombus comes out and goes and clogs an artery in the lungs, you will have a sudden onset of shortness of breath. The patient will suddenly feel, yesterday I was normal, but today I have developed shortness of breath. There will be an increase in the respiratory rate, your heart rate will increase. your saturation, oxygen saturation will decrease. You might have pain in deep breathing. You might have coughing, which is a little rare system, but coughing of blood, a feeling of lightheadedness. All these are the symptoms which you can make out with the pulmonary embolism. Also, there are some scores which we have. We have a Wells score, which is very well documented, which we calculate in the starting of the patient, which calculates the risk and the signs and symptoms. So you have cancer, paralyzed patient, bedridden patient, a swollen leg with a diameter 3 centimeter more than the other leg, large veins in the leg, previous DVT. So all the score we calculate, and if the Wells score is more than 2, then the chances of DVT are very likely. So we have to keep your eyes and ears open when you go for your rounds. So these scores also require trained doctors to be at the bedside. So a German person, Gestalt score, he said that it's more important that the doctor knows how to calculate these scores. So it's not only the scores by which we go by the signs and symptoms, we go by the history of the risk factors, and we have to keep your eyes and ears open during our rounds. That's the important thing.
Excellent. Eyes and ears open while you're doing the rounds, Dr. I get you on that point, but the question is, okay, once you suspect that a patient of a hospital-associated VT is there with you, which specific test do you recommend, do you advise for confirming the diagnosis? You have the diagnosis with you now, what kind of test do we do? A doctor has to do in this case to confirm that what he or she is seeing is correct.
So let's talk of a gamut of tests. First, everybody would have heard of the D-dimer test. The D-dimer test is more having a negative predictive value. Like if your D-dimer is normal, you're unlikely to have a DVT. But a D-dimer being high in an hospitalized patient, post-surgery patients may not be very significant. So if the D-dimer is low and you are having clinical signs and symptoms of a DVT, this patient doesn't have DVT. You have to look for other causes of the leg swelling or the tenderness. Okay. Then we have something called the venous ultrasound. Venous ultrasound, you actually see, it's easy, it's non-invasive, and you can actually see the common femoral vein, you can see all the veins, you can see the site of the thrombus, you can also see the extent of the thrombus. You have something called the Doppler ultrasound, where you compress the vein, that's compression ultrasound. So you compress the vein and then you see the flow of blood in the veins. Then you have a venography, where a dye is injected into the vein and you can see the vein outline. But that is not done nowadays because dye is harmful for the kidney. So, and you've got less invasive measure, we've got more non-invasive tests now to diagnose your DVT. Then you've got a CT MRI, which is rarely done only for DVT. But yeah, if you're suspecting a pulmonary embolism, we do something called a CT pulmonary angiography, which can tell you the extent of the DVT. It is very sensitive for large thrombosis in the main bronchus or in the lobar bronchus, but less sensitive in the small segmental branches. So CTPA for pulmonary embolism is a gold standard. And then you have something called the VQ scan, that is a ventilation perfusion scan. In the ventilation perfusion scan, you have you can make out very well that this lung is getting ventilated but not perfused because of some blockage in the artery. But again, if the patient's lung condition is bad from earlier, like he has COPD, he has ILD, he has got a damaged lung, or he has got some shunts earlier only, then this VQ scan may not be such a good idea in a damaged lung. Then you have a pulmonary angio, where you put a catheter and you actually see the pulmonary artery and you see the area of the block. So that is also rarely done because now most of the diagnosis is made by the clinical signs, the Wells criteria and the CT pulmonary angio. Then the thing is, if you have a patient who's post-op or in sepsis or in the ICU, imaging that is CTPA would be better than doing a D-dimer. Like I told you, D-dimer is very non-specific.
Yes.
If you're a younger patient, a pregnant patient, you don't want to subject the patient to a CTPA. So then in such a case patient, we do a VQ scan. So you have to select your patient and then the test. If a patient already has a lung disease, you don't do a VQ scan, you do a CTPA. If a patient is having a renal disease, then a VQ scan is better than a CTPA because in CTPA you have to give contrast. So when you have such patients, you have to decide, what can I give this patient? Can I do a VQ scan? Will it give me something? Or can I do a CT? Is dye contraindicated? So all these gamut of tests are there in pulmonary embolism.
So Dr. Awasthi, once you know that these patients do these people require urgent treatment? That's a question I had, because that's a question that has been thrown up often. And actually, what can be the complication that will arise from this? Because you did describe in detail and somewhere coming along the way that, these are the problems that can arise. But can you just summarize it for us here?
Yeah, so it is very important to recognize the VTE immediately. That is why, because first the clot forms in the vein. Now the same clot can get disturbed from there and go and clog the arteries in the lungs. So you want to reduce the chances of a pulmonary embolism, because pulmonary embolism, especially a massive pulmonary embolism, carries a high risk of death and mortality. So you want to prevent that. So you want to recognize and treat early. Also, you want to relieve the acute symptoms of the leg. Now, the patient's leg is swollen, he's having a lot of pain, he's having fever. You want to release, you've got fever in a patient who's post-op. You want to relieve those symptoms. So you want to treat and recognize early. Also, you want to now prevent extension. The clot is in the small calf vessel. You don't want the clot to increase and reach the femoral vessel or the iliac vessel. So you want to prevent the extension of the clot. So that is why all these reasons are important to recognize and treat early. Also, if you treat early, then the post-thrombotic events which occur or stay in the patient are reduced significantly. So that is why it is important that you recognize and treat early. And the complications, like I told you, the pulmonary embolism is what happens in pulmonary embolism, patient just collapses, you have a cardiac arrest. So you want to prevent all these complications. And you want, if there are small emboli, say you don't have a large pulmonary embolism, what happens in the long term, you have pulmonary artery hypertension, which causes later on a lot of difficulty in breathing in life. So you want to prevent all these sequelae happening. So you want to diagnose and treat your VTE early.
Doctor, so here I'm coming to the fact that how do you treat such a patient? You did talk in detail about that also. But as a causative factor in this entire thing that are mostly healthcare related, how do you treat such patients? I mean, do you have a specific mandate to go about?
Yeah, so we have the American Society for Hematology and the Asian Society of Venous Thromboembolism. So they have got guidelines which says that the newer oral anticoagulants are the first line of treatment over the vitamin K antagonists, especially if there is no renal or liver disease. Then if you have a proximal DVT, you want to give anticoagulant therapy over thrombolysis. You don't want to thrombolize the patient. Thrombolysis is to be done only in a life-threatening limb-threatening thrombosis. So in case there is a limb-threatening thrombosis, then you go in for thrombolysis. Otherwise, you can manage with an anticoagulant. Then if you have an acute pulmonary embolism and a right ventricular dysfunction, that's heart dysfunction, again, anticoagulant is preferred over thrombolysis, unless the patient is decompensating or he is having a sudden cardiac decompensation. So thrombolysis is for patients with low bleeding risk and high risk of decompensation is there. Then you have extensive DVT, where you have patients with extensive DVT where thrombolysis is required. And it is better to put a catheter and give a catheter-directed thrombolysis rather than just giving a systemic thrombolysis if you have a clot in the vein. But if you have a pulmonary embolism where you want to thrombolize, it is better not to put in a catheter and to give a systemic thrombolysis. Also for duration of treatment, if it is the first episode and if it is a transient risk factor means it's a surgery, patient is going to become okay later, or it is not a terminal cancer patient, or she's a pregnant lady and she's going to deliver and she's going to be okay. So in such patients, the treatment, the duration of treatment has to be 3 to 6 months. Otherwise, if a patient has a chronic health condition which is caused the VTE, or a patient which is unprovoked, you don't have any provoking factor, but the patient has developed a VTE, the treatment can be lifelong. Also, if the patient has higher risk of bleeding, then maybe we stop the treatment of DVT after 3 to 6 months. And we do not use D-dimer or ultrasound as a guide to stop our treatment. we go by the protocols which I've mentioned before. And if the patient is on vitamin K antagonist and he develops a VT on the treatment, then we have to transition the patient to low molecular weight heparin. Also, in some cases like cancer patients, low molecular weight heparin or unfractionated heparin is better than the NOACs initially, and then we shift to the NOACs. And NOACs are preferred over the vitamin K antagonists in like VT with no cancer, the patient is having no cancer, then we give these patients newer oral anticoagulants. IVC filters are rarely used, and thrombectomy also is nowadays rarely used.
So, doctor, this entire thing, we started the conversation about the hospital associated VT. I mean, that is something that you rightly said, it actually happens in the hospital. So, as we come to the end of this conversation, my last question to you would be on the preventive measures that the healthcare team can take to prevent such incidences. What kind of prevention can be done?
See, first is knowledge is power. So once you know that your surgery or your treatment has a high risk of VT, patient education is very important, and doctors should also be aware. So patient should also know what signs to look for, so that he can inform the doctor early. So this is one thing, that you have to educate your patient. You have to give him the possibility and the chances of his getting a VT, and to report any symptoms which we were discussed earlier. Then you have something called a graduated compression stockings, where you have different pressure compressions in the entire stocking the patient can wear at all time. Then you have got the intermittent pneumatic pumps, where intermittently the pressure is raised and intermittently is released. So that also helps in venous return of the heart. Then you have something called sequential compression device, where sequentially from lower it starts, then it goes upper. So sequentially the pressure goes high in the leg. It's not intermittent. And you have to have like I said, you have to have a well score in place where you are keeping an eye on the high risk patients. And we also give the Asian Society, like Venous Thrombosis Forum, which I told you, believes that for all patients who are having high risk of bleeding. Now, high risk of bleeding are patients with liver disease, or they are patients with some GI bleed history earlier, or they have been on anticoagulants earlier. So you have to have a list of those high risk patients who have high risk of bleeding. Such patients are put on mechanical devices, like we discussed, stockings or compression bandages or intermittent pneumatic pumps. But patients who do not have a moderate or they have a low risk, either the low risk or moderate risk of bleeding, such patients are put on mechanical prophylaxis and drugs, like we mentioned earlier. The Japanese, they prefer the vitamin K antagonists, and otherwise they keep an INR target of 1.5 to 2. But otherwise, most of the Western countries and we follow a target of INR of 2 to 3 if we are giving vitamin K antagonists. So all our patients are usually put on either unfractionated heparin and or low molecular heparin initially, and transition to newer anticoagulants or vitamin K anticoagulants, vitamin K VKs after the thing. And then the treatment is continued. Like I told you, the risk is for almost 90 days. So you have to put your patient on some oral anticoagulant also after that. And early ambulation and exercise always helps. So you want to move your patient early, you want to exercise them early. So
yes, I think prevention is better than cure, as you say in English, and that I think holds good for hospital-associated venous thromboembolism, which is what we discussed here today. And Dr. Surabhi Awasthi brought out in detail the entire gamut of issues that are involved with this. And I'm sure those doctors and others listening in can actually imbibe some of those points there mentioned, that take home those details, and I'm sure there'll be a value addition to whatever they're doing. Dr. Surabhi Awasthi, thank you very much for sparing your time and talking to us at Conversations India. And it was wonderful having you discuss this topic, and I'm sure we'll come back to you for more in the days to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Powered by IMC Health Bites.